Well, I think that what you've just said really boils down to saying that the investigation of our use of language and our use of concepts is an investigation of the structure of the world,
yes,
or the world
yes.
as experienced by human beings.
Yes.
There's an obvious relationship between what you've just said there and Wittgenstein's and the logical positivists' doctrine that philosophy, the proper task of philosophy, consists not in formulating doctrines, but in the activity of analysis.
Yes,
that
yes,
philosophy
that's
ought
right.
to be analysis,
Certainly, yes.
and the organon of science.
Yes.
Now, this, it seems to me, had enormous influence on the educated layman. I went up to Oxford as an undergraduate during the years after the war, and people who were not studying philosophy at all seemed to me to have come very much under the influence of some of these doctrines. In particular, if one tried to make an assertion of any kind about any subject, nothing to do with philosophy,
Yes.
one was immediately pinned against the wall by people who said to you, how would you go about verifying that statement? Or what exactly do you mean by that? What kind of an answer do you want to that question? You're conscious of that having been so?
I think I was so. I think I was partly responsible for that, yes.
Now, coming to your responsibility for this, I think it would be interesting at this stage to come to your connection with the movement. You've described who the main people in Vienna were. You've talked about what some of their central doctrines were. Now, you are well known as the figure who introduced these doctrines into England, where they have, I must say, had an enormous influence ever since, right up to and including this day.
That's true, yes.
How did you come to do that?
Well, I was up at Oxford in late 20... I came up in 29, took my schools in 1932, and I was at Christchurch, a pupil of Gilbert Ryle's, and when I took my schools I was appointed a lecturer at Christchurch and given a few months' leave of absence. And I thought I'd go to Cambridge to study under Wittgenstein, but Gilbert Ryle said, no, don't do that, go to Vienna instead. He happened to meet Schlick at a congress, I think it was in Oxford also, 2 years before, and he had half an hour's conversation with him and thought that he was interesting and got the impression something was going on in Vienna. I think he'd also perhaps read some of the articles they produced. So he said to me, why not go to Vienna, find out what's happening there. We know roughly what Wittgenstein's doing at Cambridge. We don't know what's happening in Vienna. You come back and go there and find out and tell us. Well, I didn't speak very much German. I spoke hardly any German at that time, but I thought I probably could learn enough just to follow what was going on. And so I went with a letter of introduction to Schlick from Gilbert. And Schlick, I now see, in retrospect, I see this is astonishing. At the time, it seemed to be quite natural, but said, come and join the circle. And so I did. And the only other foreigner allowed in was Quine, the American philosopher, famous American philosopher. We were there together. This was in I went to Vienna in November 32 and stayed until the spring of 33.
And you were in your very early 20s?
I was in my, yes, I was but let me think. Yes, I was. No, I was younger than that. I must have been just 23. Yes, yes. No, 22. I was 22. 22, just 22. And I sat then, and I didn't contribute. My German wasn't good enough, and there was mainly debates between Schlick and Neurath at that time. On and on and on and on the discussion went, and I sat and listened, and then came back to England, very full of all this. I wrote a paper in mine called Demonstration of the Impossibility of Metaphysics, which was simply borrowed from the verification principle. And then Isaiah Berlin said to me, we used to meet regularly and talk philosophy together. He said, you're so full of this, why don't you write a book about it? And I said, why not? And so I sat down and in 18 months wrote Language, Truth and Logic. And I wrote it when I was 24, and it was published when I was just 25.
Were you astounded by the explosive consequences?
Well, it didn't have all that great success at the beginning. It had a success at Scandard. The older philosophers at Oxford were absolutely outraged by it, and in fact it was very hard for me to get a teaching job at Oxford. I didn't get one before the war. I was always a research fellow. It was only after the war, when it got reprinted, that it had this enormous success. And I suppose already before the war, when it first came out, it did impress the younger people. They were very excited by it, because they did see this as a liberation. You see, Oxford philosophy before the war was terribly sterile. There were some old men who were only interested in the history of philosophy, only interested in repeating what Plato had said, and trying to put down anyone and say anything new. And Language, Truth and Logic, with this huge mind put onto these people, did seem to the younger people as a liberation. They did feel they could breathe. And that way it had a big historical effect.
And I'd like to hear you say something about the influence you think it had outside philosophy. It seems to me to have had obvious effects, not only in science and logic and philosophy, but in things like literary criticism or in history and so on.
It probably had less effect within science than, for example, the work of Karl Popper. His Logic of Scientific Discovery, which came out in the German edition in about the same time, about a year or so earlier, I think probably appealed more to the scientists themselves. But even so, even with language and logic, the scientists felt that this was all right. I mean, they were told they were, after all, the most important people. That they didn't have to.
And they liked that.
They didn't have to worry about the philosophers standing over and said, "Oh, we mustn't say that." Not that they had worried much, but it was nice to be told that what they were doing was really the fundamental thing.
But if one takes not only your book,
yes.
but the whole movement, of which your book
yes.
is about, logical positivism,
yes.
what do you think the influence of that was?
Well,
on
I think
other fields of
there
activity?
was a great emphasis on clarity and a great opposition to what might be called woolliness. There was a kind of injunction to look at the facts, to see things as they are, be rid of humbug. All this is very attractive to young people in any field, and it felt and it went with, I think, a general reaction against Victorian hypocrisy, really. This was seen as stripping off. It was the Hans Andersen child, which, as you said in your opening remarks, was functioning everywhere, saying the emperor has no clothes. That is, parading around with these huge robes and so on, and placing us bowed down. And the fact the fellow's naked. And this notion, the fellow's naked, which in fact, the logical parts were taken to be saying, was very exciting for anyone doing any subject.
And of course, that is enough in itself to explain the huge and passionate hostilities that were aroused against logical positivism.
Yes, indeed.
Authoritarian governments like the communist and Nazi governments banded all together, didn't they? And even liberals were discomforted by it.
Just a little, yes. They thought it was too iconoclastic.
Yes. But now, it must have had actually some real defects. What do you now, in retrospect, think that the main shortcomings of the movement were?
Well, I suppose most of the defects is that nearly all of it was false.
Well, I think you need to say a little more about that.
Well, that's being too harsh on it, because I think that I still want to say that it was true in spirit, in a way, that the attitude was right. But if one goes for the details, first of all, the verification principle never got itself properly formulated. I tried several times, and it always let in either too little or too much. And to this day, it hasn't received a properly, logically precise formulation. Then the reductionism just doesn't work. I mean, you can't reduce statements. You can't reduce even ordinary, simple statements about cigarette cases and glasses and ashtrays to statements about sense data. Let alone the more abstract statements of science. So the really exciting, strict reductionism of Schlick and the early Russell and so on doesn't work. And the end, you're looking rather wishy-washy, which almost nobody would dissent from, that a scientific hypothesis must have some relation to observation. I mean, this is all that remains there. It seems to me at least very doubtful whether statements of logic and mathematics are analytic in any interesting sense. But the whole analytic synthetic distinction has been put in question by the work of recent philosophers like Quine. And it's no longer, I think so, I still want to maintain it in some form, it's no longer so clear-cut as I once thought it was. And I'm not sure, in some sense, obviously, statements of mathematics are different from statements about the empirical world. But saying, as I said, they're true by convention, I'm not at all sure this is right. Anyhow, it needs a lot of defending. Again, the whole, I mean, certainly in language and logic, the reduction of statements about the past to statements about their future evidence for them is wrong. My treatment of other minds was wrong. My treatment of ethics, I think, was still on the right lines, though much too summary. So if you go in detail, very, very little survives. What survives is the sort of general rightness of the approach, I think.
Would you agree with me if I try to put it this way, that looking back on it, what seems to have been enormously good about the achievement of logical positivism is almost entirely negative? That is to say, it did clear away whole areas of hitherto plausible philosophizing, which were now seen under through the lenses of the new logic and the new science, not to be acceptable. So that whole traditional areas got, so to speak, cleared of lumber. But it now looks as if all they actually succeeded in doing was clear the ground, because what they tried to build on that ground that they cleared isn't standing up.
Well, it's a little more than this. It was very liberating. I think perhaps we can go back to something said not by a logical positivist, but by a pragmatist, William James. And of course, pragmatism, which came earlier, is in many ways very akin to logical positivism. William James had a phrase in which he asked for the cash value of statements. Now, I think this is very important on the positive side. The early positivists went wrong in thinking that we still maintained a gold standard. That if you presented your notes, you could get gold for them, which, of course, you can't. There isn't enough gold. and too many notes. But nevertheless, there must be some backing to the currency. And this is, I think, what comes out. But if someone makes an assertion, all right, perhaps you can't translate it into observational terms, but still, it's important to ask, for clarifying it, how you would set about testing it, what observations were. But this, I think, still holds good and is positive.
Former logical positivists like yourself,
yes.
Although you now say that most of the detailed doctrines of the course are still immensely influenced by that whole approach,
oh, yes.
and are addressing yourself to much the same questions,
yes,
but in a more liberal, open sort of
I
way.
would say so, yes. Yeah. Yes. Now, I'm a much older man. I do it much more slowly, possibly, more certainly with less brilliance. There wasn't any brilliance before. Perhaps more soundly. I hope perhaps I've learned something with the years.
Thank you very much, Professor Ayer.